It's a simple question. How do you move guns this big? When we brought them into the museum to place them on display, we used air floats and an aircraft tug. But you didn't have the luxuries of either back in 1941, especially not in a combat zone. No, to tow a gun back during World War II, you'd need an M4, just not this one. This is the M4 high-speed tractor. This is what happens when you tell Allis-Chalmers engineers to stop making small, puttering orange machines for people who farm barley. With some olive drab paint and unique engineering choices, they cooked up a vehicle so perfectly suited to its role that the United States wouldn't fully phase it out until the 1960s. It's not the first time we've spoken about artillery on this channel. While the last video I covered was on the M7 Priest, that vehicle, a howitzer motor carriage, was self-propelled artillery, and for a smaller weapon too, the 105mm howitzer. But let's talk bigger, in particular the 90mm, 155mm, and 8-inch howitzers. Eventually, all of these would get their own self-propelled versions, but for now, that is the late 30s, they existed purely as towed guns. Now, towing guns wasn't anything new in a modern army. Horses, mostly, had done it for centuries. But in 1939, as America was beginning to modernize its army, machines like tractors and trucks were on the precipice of replacing the tried-and-true equine method. Thus began the pursuit of the prime mover, broadly classified as a vehicle that could tow a heavy load. For artillery, that especially meant the transport of not only a gun, but also its crew and, if possible, ammunition. While early tractors, tested by the American military for gun towing, met that first requirement to an extent, even for the small guns they towed, they still couldn't carry a crew and ammunition as well. Of course, when America finally entered World War II in 1941, the need for a prime mover was given more thought and funding than ever before. Enter Allis-Chalmers, a company who had previously been creating simple tractors for the military, like the Model L or the M1 heavy tractor, although many tractors actually used that second title. Anyhow, as I said, a tractor can pull a gun, but that doesn't make it a prime mover. Allis-Chalmers had to create a vehicle that couldn't just pull. It had to carry cargo and men, move cross-country, and do so in a reasonable time. Most of the simple tractors could barely move just over 10 miles per hour. The design, which would evolve into the M4, dates to 1941. During that year, the T9 medium tractor was tested at Aberdeen, and the results were promising. The vehicle had a fully loaded weight, with crew and ammunition, of around 32,000 pounds, and a GM-built 6-71 diesel engine with a total max speed of 33 miles per hour. Less than a year later, in 1942, that T9 was refitted with a gasoline engine built by Waukesha, redesignating as the prototype T9E1. The tests with the gasoline engine proved satisfactory, and the T9E1 was standardized as the 18-ton high-speed tractor M4 in 1942. That high-speed designation came from the comparison to other tractors, as if you remember, those couldn't move much faster than 10 miles per hour at a top speed, so the bar is pretty low. Thus began the decades-long service of this metal box. So, does the M4 meet all the aspects of a prime mover based on the previous definition? Well, let's break it down a little bit. First, what can it tow? While the simple answer is basically anything up to around 30,000 pounds, that's being a bit too general. It's not just a question of how much this vehicle can tow, it's how it tows, if that makes any sense. For starters, it's important to note that the vehicle can't tow the big stuff across all gears. If you want to move its biggest loads, which are the 155mm gun, also known as the long tom, and the 8-inch howitzer, you have to do something special. The M4 has a 6-speed transmission, which includes your usual high, low, neutral, and reverse gears. Two more stick out a little more from the norm though. There's an engine brake gear and also a gear labeled simply creeper. The engine brake is for descending steep inclines when loaded down, but the creeper gear is the focus, as this is where the heaviest towing will occur. According to the M4's technical manual, in creeper gear, the vehicle can tow with a drawbar up to 38,700 pounds before totally stalling. But if the vehicle is revved from its idle RPM of about 800 to a maximum of 2,100 based on the engine's governor, it can actually only tow 6,410 pounds at around 7 miles per hour. With that in mind, let's consider the gun's weight. The The 155mm and 8-inch, for example, weigh about 30,000 pounds and 31,000 pounds respectively. That's a lot of numbers, but combining them we realize that the M4 is only ever really able to tow these massive guns in creeper gear, and probably comfortably doing so within a range of less than, let's say, 7 miles per hour, probably closer to 5 or 3. It means that our high-speed tractor isn't really going all that fast, but it does get the job done. Oh, and I should mention the towing capacity of any gear other than the creeper gear is far too small to move anything of note. So we know the vehicle can haul guns, although that was obvious. But how about ammunition transport, the second purpose of any good prime mover? Looking at the rear of the vehicle from a top view, we can find the storage bins. The smaller bins on the left and right of the vehicle can store propellant tubes filled with powder charges if necessary. The center bin differs between the two classes of the M4 tractor, A and B. The A class featured ammunition racks for 3-inch or 90mm rounds. The B class, which is what we have behind me, has space for 155mm rounds, 8-inch rounds, or 240mm rounds. Our M4 has some dummy 155mm rounds sitting in the metal lockdown plates, which keep them from slipping around while the vehicle is in motion. These metal plates are in fact reversible. Flipping them around has different size holes, which fit the larger 8-inch rounds, so they're a bit utilitarian. A notable physical trait of the B class as well is the addition of the swing crane here. Equipped with a simple chain hoist, this addition was important for lifting the 100 to 200 pound rounds, depending on the towed weapon, up into the storage space. We can still deploy the crane today because of its simple construction. All you have to do is raise the crane body and insert this lock pin into a hole. How our M4 has retained the lock pin for so long is a small miracle. Speaking of rounds, as you can see, the 155mm rounds in this example are so large that the tractor itself could only carry a maximum of 20. Thankfully, every artillery battery would contain not only loaded M4s, but also support vehicles which carried additional ammunition. Some M4s were actually modified to carry additional rounds rather than crew, replacing the rear seating with more ammunition racks. These M4s were referred to as M4Cs, but were rare. Finally, I should note that this ammo storage bin would be covered by a tarp while the vehicle is in motion to keep dust out, but of course ours is missing that bit. The final requirement to consider on our prime mover here is the ability to transport the crew needed to operate whatever weapon it's towing. Sticking with our B class, both the 155mm gun and the 8-inch howitzer that this vehicle would tow had a crew of 14, not counting the chief of section or the 2 drivers that could be used for the vehicle. Looking at this diagram from the field manual for the 8-inch howitzer, we can see that. However, if we want to be technical and count everyone who's riding with the vehicle, that is the entire section, both crew, chief, and drivers, that is 17 men. In the end, the M4 actually can't transport all 17 of those men. Counting the single driver, the vehicle actually only has a maximum listed capacity of 11 men. That's 3 sitting in the front and 8 back there in the rear. Yet in field manuals, while the M4 is not always specified as the prime mover of choice, as we saw in the diagram, the military still expected the entire section to travel with the one vehicle. At least it was assumed. But I suppose anything is possible with bench seating. But this also explains why, despite the creation of the M4 here, normal trucks were still occasionally used as prime movers anyway. In summary here, despite that oddity in listed crew size, the M4, as you'd expect, meets the requirements of a prime mover quite well. But that's the base definition. Moving to the interior and exploring the exterior here, we can find all kinds of subsystems and technical quirks that further exemplify this vehicle's role. The interior of our M4 high-speed tractor shares a lot of similarities in terms of controls and dials and such with the M4 medium tank, the Sherman. We've got all of our usual controls to start, of course, a clutch, an accelerator pedal, we've got handbrakes, and we've even got a hand throttle here underneath the control panel. But when you start to look beyond that, that's truly where the similarities end. First, we can start at the emergency brake. There isn't a lever for one like you'd see in a tank. Rather, the emergency brake has just been moved to the tops of the handbrakes here. So these little pins that you'll push on here, I'm not going to do it because they're a real pain to reset. They actually drop a little wedge down into the gearing of the handbrake, which in turn holds the handbrake in place and therefore the vehicle. You might think that the lever in between our handbrakes here is some kind of emergency brake, but it's actually not. It's a PTO or a power takeoff lever, which in a nutshell is taking the engine power and applying it to the vehicle's winch. To my left is the winch lever, although it really should just be called the winch brake, as that's its technical use. And just so you know, the M4's winch here can pull around 30,000 pounds. To my far right here in the cabin towards the floor is what's called the hull drain lever, which is kind of this knob down by the floor. Pulling on that opens a small valve in the bottom of the vehicle's hull, which allows water to drain out of it. As water can collect in the vehicle when, as the tech manual states, the vehicle is left out in the rain, has just been washed, or completes a fording maneuver, which is basically crossing a small river or stream. Coming back to the control scheme in front of me, we have another pedal that I haven't mentioned yet, this vertical one that sits next to the accelerator. It's not a clutch and it's not an additional accelerator, it's actually an additional brake. And it's not a brake for the vehicle itself, rather it's a brake for the towed load. Now, when you push on this pedal, it's either going to activate your air brakes or your electric brakes, or both of them, depending on what you have connected, and we'll see those connections later on. But the thing is that this brake pedal sometimes doesn't give you the exact finesse you need for either one of those braking systems. So if you want to fine tune it, there's two other special instruments here in the cabin that do exactly that. So over here we'd have the load control dial, although ours is of course missing the actual knob here. Turning that dial is going to manually increase or decrease the power of your electric brakes. But to do the air brakes, you come back over here to my left and you can pull on this lever here to manually increase or decrease the pressure of your air braking system. Honestly though, the greatest disadvantage of sitting here in the driver's seat of the M4 high-speed tractor though is its lack of legroom for a guy like me. Now I mentioned before the Waukesha built engine. This engine, called the 145GZ, is an inline 6-cylinder water-cooled model. It boasts 210 net horsepower. The water cooling aspect makes a lot of sense from an operations perspective. This is a vehicle that will be moving at very slow speeds on the average, and often it will be left idling. So an air-cooled engine like the one we see in many of our tanks simply wouldn't cut it for cooling. Of course, the engine bay here is still large, allowing for plenty of ventilation, as the radiator over there is still fan-cooled. Filling up the radiator with water for the coolant system was pretty simple, as long as you had a ladder. Of course, climbing up here like I've just done isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, but it wasn't impossible. That said, the water circulating through this system did occasionally have to be switched out for fresh water, and that's per the vehicle's technical manual. Thankfully, the M4, as we see here, has a little feature built into it that allows it to carry extra water cans in this compartment here right on top of the vehicle. Now, to get all the water out of the system, all you had to do was remove a small drain plug down at the bottom rear of the vehicle. Ours is unfortunately missing that plug today, so we wouldn't be able to fill it up even if we wanted to. The last thing I'd like to mention while I'm up here on the top of the vehicle is this little astromech droid that we have attached to our M4. It's actually called the air pre-cleaner, and its job is quite interesting. The pre-cleaner's job is to be the first filter for air that will be passing into the engine. The air passes up through the head of the unit and will move by angled immobile fan blades right here, which are going to disrupt the airflow. The dust, which is disrupted, ends up moving upwards and collects inside the pre-cleaner, which is this section here. And you know when to clean the pre-cleaner when the observation window gets partially covered in dust. Once all that takes place, the air continues up into the rest of the pre-cleaner and then goes down through a tube, which just leads to a quite large oil bath filter right before it enters the engine. Ain't that interesting? All right, quick speed around here so I can cover some other aspects of the M4's design before we finally wrap things up. The first, the 50 caliber machine gun up here on top of the vehicle. Its only real purpose isn't defending the vehicle against infantry or anything. It's just going to be firing at some aircraft, which is nice enough for an artillery crew. But let's go down and take a look at the tracks. Some people think here that the track assembly and the suspension system on our M4 high-speed tractor are the same, or at least pulled from, the M2 and M3 series of light tanks, the Stuart, for example. And you might be thinking that because of this trailing idler wheel that we have here. Indeed, that looks very similar to an M2 or M3 light tank's suspension, but here's the deal. When we think about these tracks here and even the drive sprocket, this has all been pulled from the M4 series of medium tanks, the M4 Sherman. And the bogie wheels are almost completely unique to the M4 high-speed tractor. They're an early version of horizontal volute spring suspension, or HVSS suspension, something we won't see fully evolved until the M4A3 series of medium tanks. And while we're here, I should probably mention another variant of the M4 high-speed tractor, the A1, which spread these tracks out a little bit from the hull and therefore allowed for the mounting of those extended grousers or duckbills like you'd see on an M4A3 E9 Sherman. But let's go around to the back to talk about one more auxiliary system, and it has to do with the air brake connectors here. And we also have the electric brake connector as well, which I said I would mention earlier. But coming back to these air brake connectors, one of them, this red one here, the emergency, can actually be used in a pinch as a tire pump. It can pump tires anywhere under 105 pounds of pressure. If you need above 105 pounds, you're going to have to use this other valve, which is hidden away next to the vehicle's winch. All right, let's wrap it up. The M4 high-speed tractor was an exemplary prime mover, serving the U.S. military for nearly 2 decades. While self-propelled guns eventually took over, reducing the reliance on towed artillery, the need for prime movers didn't exactly disappear. Later designs like the M5, M6, and even the M548 Universal Carrier owe a great deal to the M4's legacy. If you'd like to learn more about self-propelled guns, check out our previous video on the M7 Priest. But for now, remember, the M4 high-speed tractor was the unsung hero behind many of the war's biggest guns.